The government coordinated with social media companies to make sure people like me had our accounts suspended. While they allow porn to proliferate, anyone is allowed to attack Donald Trump. There's actually plenty of proof that the government colluded with social media to censor people, and I'm one of them right here.
But let's go ahead and read some of these quotes that a member of this subcommittee has actually said. These are public quotes about religion. Let's go through those. Satan's controlling the church. The church is not doing its job. This comment was made just in 2020 by a member of this subcommittee. The same member of the subcommittee said that Muslims, quote, do not belong in our government. I also find that very offensive. The same representative of the subcommittee has mocked and vilified Muslim members of Congress, saying they represent, and I quote, an invasion of our government, and accused them of being terrorist sympathizers because of their religion.
Our policies and our laws are being completely abused, and in the current administration, we have a policy of open borders that is causing unbelievable crime.
Biden administration's open border policies have caused incalculable human cost. Open border policies have wreaked havoc on American communities.
The House majority continues to claim that the border is somehow wide open, a myth that we have disproved time and time again through testimony by frontline officials here in front of this committee. The border is not open. It never has been. I'd also want to remind the people and the people that are watching, the American public, that every member of the Republican House majority, they actually voted to eliminate the Shelter and Services Program, which provides the most effective federal support for bordered communities. Bordered communities actually need more support, not less. Now, I think my colleagues, of course, might be projecting. Big corporations, as we all know, are doing just fine. Meanwhile, Republicans are willfully ignoring the fact that wealthy conservative donors are lavishing gifts on the conservative justices of the Supreme Court. Now, Republicans claim to be concerned with outside money influencing the legal system, but only when it hurts their corporate backers. When right-wing billionaires create conflicts of interest for the highest court in our country, they are completely silent. So I look forward to the many hearings that we have on Clarence Thomas and the justices and their illegal gifts that they're receiving and not disclosing. And I want to show you guys one of my absolute favorite memes, which to me, this is a perfect example of what's actually been going on as it relates to the American consumer. We have our pharmacy benefit managers pointing at Big Pharma and Big Pharma pointing back at our pharmacy benefit managers. Now, there's also a reason why Pharma is spending millions of dollars over here to trash PBMs. And that's also to distract the American people from their central role in driving up costs while stuffing their own pockets. This next tweet, actually, and I'll just go ahead and read what it says here. It says by a member of this committee, the FDA should not approve the COVID vaccines. There are too many reports of infection and spread of COVID-19 among vaccinated people. I'm just clearly pointing out facts from public statements.
The chair reminds the gentleman from California to observe proper decorum. It is a violation of House rules and the rules of this committee to engage in personalities regarding other members or to question the motives of a colleague.
Chairman, I don't know that the gentleman from California was disparaging anyone. He put up a tweet that is a fact that exists online, available for anybody to look at.
In the past few weeks, there's been a lot of controversy about a movie called Sound of Freedom. And I can't understand why anyone would say anything negative about a movie that's trying to expose child sex trafficking, especially when it involves our United States border. Is our current administration's border policies contributing to child sex trafficking?
They are certainly facilitating it, yes.
Having a top government official on the Mexican cartel's payroll help the cartels operate with impunity, moving tons of drugs around the world and make billions.
And so we keep hearing over and over again solutions that are not serious, which is why we never seem to discuss treatment programs here in this committee. There's no answers to how to improve access to health care or tackle the mental health crisis that's happening in our country. We just keep having the same Groundhog Day hearing over and over again, blaming migrants for a drug crisis that continues to replay itself hearing after hearing. And what I want to know is why we're not actually investigating real family corruption. They want to attack President Biden's family, who actually never worked in the White House, which is incredibly hypocritical. Yet we have not yet talked about these guys that actually worked in the White House. Now, we do know today that we're not here because of any wrongdoing of President Biden, but because this is all part of Donald Trump's campaign. And his most extreme allies, including some members of this committee, are now retaliating. In fact, some members have been trying to impeach the president since day one. Now, this is a tweet here. I'm going to read it. It says, 2 years ago, I introduced articles to impeach Joe Biden on his first full day in office. We will impeach Biden, bolded with an exclamation point, and you see the actual resolution here. So we have the receipts to prove it. There really is no reason why. They don't care why they want to impeach the president, but they've been trying to do it now for years. Here you have, of course, a member of this oversight committee posting about introducing articles of impeachment on President Biden's very first day in office. And now the Speaker of the House is empowering these people in a desperate attempt to keep his job. And I think it's also important to hear how we're talking about security and our threats to the homeland, how the current head of the Republican Party spent Veterans Day just recently. So I want to read you this first sentence. In honor of our great veterans on Veterans Day, we pledge to you that we will root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country, lie, steal, and cheat on elections, and will do anything possible, whether legally or illegally, to destroy America and the American dream. Here we see Donald Trump calling his fellow Americans vermin and threatening to root out people based on their political beliefs. This is the kind of rhetoric that reminds me of the worst types of dictators in history, and it's not Trump's first time using this kind of rhetoric. He told an audience in Iowa that immigrants were poisoning the blood of our country, that's a quote. He has promised to violate federal laws in order to build mass deportation camps and promised to restore his Muslim ban. He even wants to cancel legal status for certain categories of immigrants. Donald Trump, of course, has had dinner and hosted open Holocaust deniers and white nationalists. And we all, of course, remember that he praised the white nationalist Charlottesville marchers who chanted, "Jews will not replace us." And of course, he faces federal felony charges for his role in the January 6th insurrection. The form of the resolution is as follows. House Resolution 114, resolved that pursuant to Article 1, Section 5, Clause 2 of the Constitution of the United States, Representative George Santos be, and he hereby is, expelled from the House of Representatives. The former president, now of course trying to be president again, Donald Trump, tried to destroy the World Health Organization and separate the United States from any of its health responsibilities. He quoted it as extraordinarily bad, a threat to all Americans, the U.S. role will be diminished, it's short-sighted, unnecessary, and unequivocally dangerous. He is talking about the world's leading health collaborative that brings countries together to take on pandemics. And we know, and at least I believe, that he's also responsible in large part for the failures of the last pandemic that led to the death, as we know, of over 1 million Americans. And so would you also agree that supporting the World Health Organization is critical to the success of American health? Assistant Secretary?
Yes,
Please.
Mr. Congressman, I would agree that it's critical. Of course, we need an effective WHO to do so, but they've done much over the past 75 years to demonstrate their value to Americans in the world.
Mr. Schwartzman, casinos were mandated to cap at 50% capacity, but yet churches were capped at 50 people. Didn't even matter how many people are in their congregation. Do you consider that even-handedly?
I'm not a public health official or
That's a
local
yes or
official.
no, Mr. Schwartzman.
Well, I think that's a question that you would have to ask Nevada state officials. And the Supreme Court, when it decided Calvary Chapel on July 24th, 2020.
Mr. Schwartzman, I'm asking you, do you consider in your opinion that even-handedly?
The court recognized, I think, that 1,100 people in the United States died the day that the Supreme Court made that decision, and it was for local officials to respond to those conditions on the ground as they saw fit. And the
Mr. Schwartzman, shutdowns that supposedly prevent the spread of a virus cause suicides to increase in every single age group of all ages. You believe that teenagers should commit suicide because people with comorbidities such as obesity and people at very high risk of dying from COVID-19 is okay as long as the Supreme Court says so. Let's move on.
The risk of the various kinds of activities that you're describing varied greatly, and public health officials use scientific assessments and data to distinguish those kinds of activities and to regulate accordingly.
So you're talking about like Dr. Richard Levine, the man that calls himself supposedly Rachel Levine. I want you to know the Bill of Rights is not a suicide pact. It's important because it protects our rights. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Just in reference to what we just heard, that was incredibly appalling, transphobic, jokes about suicide. And of course, these attacks on religion and on the response today have been really, really hard to hear and hard to see. And I know we've been talking a lot about religion and our rights as Americans, and so I think we should probably review that a little bit and actually talk about what actually somebody and a member of the subcommittee has actually said about religion. So
Point of personal privilege.
I'm
He's
just
attacking my character.
I haven't attacked anyone's. I don't think I've said anyone's name actually, so I'm not attacking anyone's character. This same member of the subcommittee claimed that Jewish bankers were starting wildfires with lasers from space, and this same member compared vaccine requirements to the Holocaust. And so these attacks being made by this member I find pretty disgusting, comparatively looking at the record of what this member has actually said. But we've been talking about the pandemic, or that's what I thought we were going to talk about today. So let's talk about the pandemic and focus on the president that was actually there when the closures first started, and that was, of course, former President Donald Trump. Now, Donald Trump has also made numerous bigoted statements about Muslims, Jewish people, and many others. We've all seen those press reports. I won't go through them in my short time today. But this hearing is about COVID, and so let's talk about what actually the president did. And really briefly, Mr. Schwartzman, will you concur that when the closures first started, including at religious institutions, that the president was actually Donald Trump?
Yes, of course.
And let's talk about some of the highlights. Out of the gate, Donald Trump and his administration stumbled. They got testing wrong early on. The administration opted, as we know, to use a COVID testing protocol that contained design issues that set us back in our early testing. Tests were nowhere to be found. On PPE, Trump put his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, in charge of the supply chain task force. I mean, come on. He put together a group of volunteers that knew nothing, and none had experience about the supply chains or distribution experience at all. That's the task force that the president put together. Huge failures on PPE and getting access across the country to cities like mine, where I was the mayor of. In fact, Republican Governor Larry Hogan said at the time, and I quote, "Waiting around for the president to run the nation's response was hopeless." And so we've got to be honest with the American people about what Trump actually did during that time and some of the things that Donald Trump said. In fact, some of them are right here on this board. He said that we have it totally under control, quote, "One day it's like a miracle, it will disappear," end quote. Another quote, "It's going away." And another one, "It will go away and we're going to have a great victory." That was the mood and the statements made by the president that actually ordered many of these closures that all of you as witnesses are discussing today, and that my Republican colleagues seem to love to forget. That it was actually President Donald Trump that was there that actually led all of these closures that began happening. So I think that if we really want to get to the bottom of what the pandemic closures were about, I think President Trump should be the one actually addressing these questions at this hearing. So I just want to just say finally that the direct result of this incompetence that happened in that administration, which, by the way, President Biden helped fix, cost as many as 200,000 lives that were lost needlessly in those first few months during the pandemic. And so we want to talk about religious discrimination, we want to talk about preparedness about the pandemic, but we refuse to talk about the failures of the Trump administration and how it costs lives in this country. That's what started this mess. That's what we should be talking about. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. I was mayor of Long Beach for the last 8 years. So we have a large public health department, city about 500,000 people. So I saw firsthand the impact of our vaccine rollout and how important it was to public health. And our region and broader LA County was hit really hard during 2020, 2021, during that winter surge. Of course, before vaccines were available, our regional healthcare system was at a breaking point. ICUs were full. On certain days, we were losing dozens of lives across LA County. It was a horrific experience. In my city alone, we lost 1,300 people from our community. We know that across the country, we've lost over 1.3 million American lives. One of those lives was my mother. Another was my stepfather. I know the impacts of this pandemic and how destructive it can be on families. I want to remind us that during that time, even there was a regional quality health index around on the quality of air, and the amount of crematoriums that were actually having to be in operation were damaging health air quality. That's how horrific the time was. And I think it's important to remember how bad the pandemic actually impacted us, because I think we have a tendency to forget the lives impacted and the real impact to our economy as well. We did everything we could to get folks vaccinated in Long Beach. We were the first city to vaccinate 99% of our seniors in California, the first city in the state of California to vaccinate our teachers. Both the governor and the president called our approach a national model. But I'm very concerned about the attack on vaccination efforts. I'm very concerned when folks within the Congress, even on this committee, put out disinformation about what vaccines are. There are 3 million Americans today that are likely alive thanks to vaccinations. We know this. And despite this, many of our colleagues in the majority have chosen to undermine COVID vaccinations in general. I want to also point out that misinformation hurts our efforts. We know that Republicans in general are 2.5 more times likely to believe misinformation, and studies have shown that states with higher vaccination rates have had significantly fewer COVID deaths. So these are facts. I want to share some examples of this harmful misinformation today and the rhetoric that has actually led to, I think, a huge public health emergencies in this country. This is the first one tweet that's actually been sent out by a member of this committee, which essentially says that we're suggesting that COVID vaccines are associated with nearly 6,000 deaths and actually encouraging folks to not get vaccinations. Dr. Tan, what do you think about this claim about the 6,000 deaths around vaccinations?
Well, in this country, we have a very, very robust vaccine system that looks at all the different potential adverse effects that may be associated with vaccines. So the problem is that some of these deaths, even though they are reported, it may have been the vaccine was given, but the death was not due to the vaccine itself.
Absolutely right. And to say no, do not get the vaccine is completely irresponsible. Would you agree with that?
I agree.
Dr. Tan, I also would like to go to the second.
The gentleman will suspend.
I'm just clearly pointing out facts from public
The
statements.
chair reminds the gentleman from California to observe proper decorum. The issues we are debating are important ones that members feel deeply about. While vigorous disagreement is part of the legislative process, members are reminded that we must adhere to established standards of decorum in debate. Remarks of that type are not permitted by the rules and are not in keeping with the best traditions of our committee. The chair will enforce these rules of decorum at all times and urges all members to be mindful of their remarks.
Because we customarily, throughout the Congress, will take quotations and quotes and use them once they appear in the public record. I think this is in keeping with that, and I don't think this was an effort to disparage, but an effort to instead point out what a particular member or members of this committee may have put out themselves in the public space that we all refer to as social media.
At this point, it is the ruling of the chair that the gentleman may proceed. However, I remind the gentleman to be cautious and to understand the decorum as he proceeds with his remaining time of 1 minute and 46 seconds.
Thank you very much. I'll just read the next few public statements. I appreciate that. This tweet actually says that vaccinated employees get a vaccination logo just like the Nazis forced Jewish people to wear a gold star. Vaccine passports and mask mandates create discrimination against unvaxxed people who trust their immune systems to a virus that is 99% survivable. Do you think that this tweet, which compares vaccinated people to Jewish folks living under the Nazis, what kind of impact would this have, you think, on public health?
I think it would have a negative impact on public health, and I respectfully disagree with that particular sentiment that has been put forth. I mean, we know that vaccines are life-saving, and they should be made available to everyone so that there's no disparity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tan. I really appreciate that. I think it's really important for us to remind the committee and the public about public statements that are made by members of this committee, particularly as questions are asked. And so thank you very much all for your service. I yield back. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. And it's apparent that we're here today because our Republican colleagues are worried that it's too easy for the American people to bring legitimate claims against big corporations that poison and pollute our communities. And as they put it in their press release when they announced this hearing today, they're concerned that, quote, financiers are hijacking America's courtrooms. So if they want to talk about money in the court, let's talk about Justice Clarence Thomas and the many allegations of ethical lapses and conflicts of interest that came to light just a few months ago. So we're going to keep this simple. Now, first, I have a photo here. We see Justice Thomas with his very generous friend, Harlan Crow, who we've heard a lot about. We know that Crow is the conservative billionaire who has poured enormous amounts of money into Republican causes, funded right-wing advocacy organizations, including those, of course, run by Justice Thomas's wife, Ginny Thomas, who has had, of course, cases before the court. Now, some of these gifts that have been given to Crow by Thomas, let's list those. Justice Thomas regularly stays at Harlan Crow's private lakeside resort in New York, which I hear is very lovely. In 2017, Justice Thomas stayed at the resort with fellow guests from Verizon, the American Enterprise Institute, and PricewaterhouseCoopers, to name a few. In 2019, Justice Thomas flew on Harlan Crow's private jets and enjoyed 9 days of island hopping in Indonesia on Crow's 160-foot yacht, which I've never seen a yacht that large. I'm sure it's very lovely. It came with servants and private chefs. If Justice Thomas had actually chartered that yacht himself, it would have cost him $500,000. Now, Justice Thomas also accepted a $19,000 Bible that from Harlan Crow, of course, that once belonged to Frederick Douglass. And apparently, so this must be the same Bible that the justice is using to take away rights from women and gay people. Now, Harlan Crow's foundation also made a over $100,000 donation to Yale Law School for the Justice Thomas Portrait Fund. Now, Harlan Crow purchased Justice Thomas' family home and a property where Thomas's mother has lived rent-free. And Thomas Crow also paid the boarding school tuition of Thomas's grandnephew, Harlan Crow, valued at over $100,000. So the list, of course, goes on and on and on. And if this isn't corruption, I don't know what is. Now, Professor Clark, I want to thank you for your testimony today. How was Justice Thomas able to accept these lavish gifts? And how is it possible that a sitting Supreme Court justice can take so much without scrutiny?
Congressman Garcia, Supreme Court Justice Thomas has engaged in this practice of receiving these lavish gifts, as you outlined. And even more disturbing, in my view, is the fact that he failed to disclose those gifts, or many of them. And he has gotten away with failing to disclose until these gifts and other inaccuracies were discovered by journalists or other non-government organizations. So there is a lack of
And we're to assume that Justice Thomas is trying to keep these things hidden from the public. I mean, he did not disclose his gifts. Was that your assessment?
Yes, it is true that he did not disclose these gifts.
And so what he chose not to disclose was traveling on lavish large yachts, was being treated to the best food, was traveling in Indonesia, was getting $20,000 Bibles, was gifts to his favorite charities, and he chose to not disclose any of these information to the public. Is that correct?
Congressman Garcia, I believe that the Bible may have been included on one of his
Good for him. That's good for him.
I think that everything else you mentioned, he did not disclose until called to account.
Absolutely. And of course, we know the issue, of course, is not just the gifts themselves, but it's actually the disclosure process. We also know another issue is that some of these gifts have had connections to cases that have been in front of the justice himself. And so these are with other business histories tied to Mr. Crow. Now, this is what happens when we combine big money donors with weak judicial ethics rules. We must do more to bolster the integrity of the Supreme Court. I want to thank Ms. Clark for your work in these efforts. Like all of us on our side of the aisle, we want to put the American people before corporations and put the Constitution above conflicts of interest. Thank you, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to just begin by recapping for the American people what we've seen so far today. My Democratic colleagues have done a great job of showing that there's absolutely zero evidence linking President Joe Biden to any wrongdoing. Zero, none. This hearing is a complete waste of time 2 days before a MAGA government shutdown. And we also know that Hunter Biden never held any sort of public office. And there is no evidence that he ever influenced any kind of policy in the White House. There's no evidence that he and his father's finances were ever linked. And we've spoken to many witnesses to prove that. And in fact, none of the witnesses here actually have any direct evidence that there's any sort of wrongdoing, and that was repeated here by these witnesses. So instead, We're back to falling on MAGA conspiracy theories that Rudy Giuliani parroted over and over again. This farce is all about House Republicans trying to re-elect their beloved leader, Donald Trump. They want to talk about Jared Kushner, who's right over here. We know that Jared Kushner, who's Donald Trump's son-in-law, was given enormous power in the White House. When Jared joined the White House, he was so unfit and unqualified and with so many conflicts of interest, he couldn't even get a security clearance. His father-in-law, Donald Trump, had to intervene, overriding national security officials. We also know that just months after Jared left the White House, the Saudi royal family gave him $2 billion, with a B, into the Kushner hedge fund. And right now, Jared is pocketing an additional $25 million a year in fees. This is a man who was put at the head of Middle East policy in the White House. We know he personally intervened to give the Saudis a $110 billion arms deal that was opposed by folks all across the government. He supported the Saudis with their brutal war in Yemen, even after they murdered Jamal Khashoggi, a journalist, of course, who was an American resident. The Saudi crown prince bragged to other heads of state that Kushner, and I quote, was in his pocket. Even Trump's first Secretary of State complained that this is inappropriate. Now, Jared delivered for the Saudis over and over again, and he was rewarded. Even advisors to the crown prince advised against the $2 billion hedge fund investment, yet he went forward anyways. So we know that Jared Kushner, a senior White House aide and Donald Trump's son-in-law, was doing favors for a foreign government. Now, this is actually an enormous family scandal that this committee should be investigating. And I think Chris Christie put it well when he said that the grift from this family, the Trump crime family, in my opinion, is breathtaking. You also need to take my word for it. But this is actually what our committee chairman actually said about the Kushners. I'm just quoting our chairman. I have been vocal that I think what Kushner did crossed the line of ethics. Now, Mr. Chairman, I completely agree that the Kushners crossed the line of ethics, and I want to know what we're going to do about it and when that hearing is actually going to be here in front of us. See, if we're not too busy, maybe next week during the Republican MAGA shutdown, we can actually have a hearing with Jared Kushner, which is clearly in a very corrupt arms deal here, a deal around his investment firm. And the chairman can also be involved in that since he also thinks there's problems. Ultimately, the person pulling the strings here is Donald Trump, a dangerous man facing federal and state indictments who's out for revenge. And he's been doing this his whole career. And I want to show you a second tweet, again by a member of this committee. They are trying to expunge Donald Trump's impeachment, as you can see here, which is also unconstitutional. I'm going to read this tweet. Expunge the wrongful Trump impeachments. Impeach criminal Biden. These are political stunts to appeal to an extremist base, and they seize control of this conference. If we don't act, they'll threaten our democracy again. This impeachment is a farce with no evidence, and with that, I yield back. Now, Mr. Secretary, Director Wray, I'm not going to ask you to respond directly to Donald Trump's statements, but I think we can all agree that they're not worthy of certainly anybody running for president. And as we move into this election year, I'm deeply concerned about Donald Trump, particularly as he faces more and more pressure from his supporters that may try to invoke as additional violence that we might see from fringe supporters of his. Now, Mr. Secretary, I wrote to you ahead of Donald Trump's first indictment expressing concerns about his ability to provoke violent attacks, and I'd like to thank you for your ongoing attention to this matter, and more broadly for taking on the challenges we have around white supremacy, around the huge actions that are happening across this country that impact a lot of people. We also know that Donald Trump isn't the only politician that has used a history of, or has a history of violent rhetoric in this country, and we need to call it out at every single turn. I want to just finally, Mr. Director Wray, I want to raise one final issue with you. The Anti-Defamation League found that in 2022, mass shootings in the U.S. accounted for most extremism-related fatalities last year, with about 80% of those murders committed by white supremacists. We saw that in the Dallas area mall case, in the Dollar General store in Jacksonville. There's been additional shootings after shootings. What would you need from Congress to help you better tackle this threat as it relates to mass shootings?
Well, our budget request that went up in the fiscal 24 budget request includes a number of resources for counterterrorism, including that would speak to this threat. That's important because, as you've heard in my testimony here today, the foreign terrorist threat is not only not abating, but it's intensifying. And so we certainly can't be put in a position where we're having to, rob Peter to pay Paul, if you will, to protect the American people from all forms of terrorist attack.
Thank you
There
for
also,
your
I
service,
should say, on the issue of mass acts of violence, mass shootings, putting ideology aside or anything, or motivation, I think there are also parts of the appropriation request that go to our ability at NICS to do background checks in a timely way and process, obviously, to make sure that guns are not purchased by people who are prohibited under existing law from having them.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for making the time to be here today as well, and for your service to health, not just here at home, but across the world. We know that the World Health Organization plays a critical role in global response, which impacts, of course, everything that happens here in the U.S. During the pandemic especially, we know that the World Health Organization was a critical partner to everything going on globally across the world. And just as our own country's response to the pandemic was imperfect, and we learned as we went along, we also know that also was the case for the WHO. Everyone across the globe struggled to address this crisis as it happened, and we lost millions and millions of lives, not just here at home, but across the world. I'm grateful for each of you to speak candidly about ways we can improve, and in ways we can not just strengthen our partnerships, but also look at lessons learned. I'm also grateful to my colleagues here today for the chance to have a serious discussion about how to prevent and respond future emergencies, but we should be also very clear. There's a difference between a good faith conversation about ways to improve the World Health Organization and proposals to slash the World Health Organization, including critical funding, or even withdraw from the World Health Organization completely. Now, at our last hearing in the subcommittee, we heard about the importance of international biosafety standards for medical research. We had a great discussion, and everyone agreed that we needed both additional funding and oversight for global biosafety and biosecurity. There was wide agreement on this. Assistant Secretary Pace, if I'm not mistaken, the WHO plays a huge role in safeguarding biosafety and biosecurity in our laboratories. Is that correct?
Yes, Mr. Congressman, that's correct. It's important.
Thank you. That's what I understand as well. So if my colleagues are serious about international biosafety standards, it sure seems that co-sponsoring bills that are titled Withdraw the United States from the Constitution of the World Health Organization, or another bill that is titled the No Taxpayer Funding for the World Health Organization Act, it would appear to me that bills like this would actually hurt global health and hurt our health programs here in the United States. Would you agree that would be the case, Assistant Secretary?
Thank you, Mr. Congressman. We would certainly not want anything to hinder WHO's ability to protect Americans and the world.
And finally, I just want to also add that I think it's also unfortunate that there's so much vaccine misinformation happening just right now and across this country and across the world. And it's happening here in the subcommittee. I mean, just last week we had a colleague that published a post openly encouraging parents to defy pediatricians and refuse childhood vaccinations, which we know is not advised by the medical science here today. And anti-vaccine misinformation is dangerous and is costing American lives. Childhood vaccine rates against preventable diseases like measles, polio, and hepatitis are declining to dangerously low levels. And we're seeing a resurgence of some of these same diseases in our communities because of declining vaccination rates. And so while we're having these hearings on the broader pandemic, we must also remember to be honest, focus on the truth, and support organizations that are battling pandemics and trying to keep people safe. And so with that, I yield back.